Okay. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to Science on Tap. If you could grab a seat, we'll get going this evening. Thank you very much. Welcome to Science on Tap. Thank you for coming. My name is Susan Knight. I work up at UW Trout Lake Station. Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea, the idea that the boundaries of the university are the boundaries of the state. And our partners in Science on Tap are UW Trout Lake Station, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, the Minocqua Public Library, the Lakeland Badger chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and of course our hosts here at the Minocqua Brewing Company. And we are largely funded by a grant from the Brittingham Fund, so thanks to them. Reminder that there are 4 ways to watch. Of course, you can all come here, which is the best. You can also be live streaming at the Minocqua Public Library. And we also have live streaming for anybody who has a good enough internet connection right from your own home. And so just go to Science on Tap Minocqua and click on Watch Science on Tap Live. And finally, we also archive everything. So we have a full recording of everything tonight, and then we also make a 10-minute short version so that you could share it with your friends. And so those are all available off of our website. So our next event will be December 4th, and we're going to have insects with P.J. Leash of the UW-Madison Department of Entomology Insect Diagnostic Lab. And if any of you ever listened to Larry Mueller on Wisconsin Public Radio, PJ took over from Phil Pelletieri a couple of years ago, and he's on once a month dealing with everybody's insect questions. So he's very much in tune with the public and the kind of questions you might get. So tonight, though, we have Dr. David McFarland. He's a wildlife research team leader in the Wisconsin DNR Office of Applied Science. He works over in Rhinelander. In this role, he coordinates the department's statewide wildlife research program. And Dr. McFarland was educated at Messiah College and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He previously held the positions of large carnivore specialist and wolf, bear, and fur bearer research scientist for the DNR. Dr. McFarland said that science is alive and well at the Wisconsin DNR. So let's give a clap for that. Woohoo! The agency has a vibrant team of researchers working on important issues to inform the decisions made by the agency. This is certainly true of Wildlife Research Program, where we currently have over 20 active research projects focused on the most pressing wildlife issues our state is facing. So Dave works out of the Rhinelander office, as I said. He lives in Rhinelander with his wife and 2 children. And the last time he was here, he's one of our few repeat performers here. He only had 1 child, so it was a while ago. And that is a girl, and she is 5? She's 5, so it was a while ago. So anyway, very exciting. Belated congratulations. Okay. So because he's been here before and he already gave me a story and I didn't want to repeat it, so I thought I would try a little something different with the introduction. So instead of asking our audience a question about the speaker, I'm going to ask the speaker, I'm going to put him on the spot and ask him some questions, all right? And since we're talking about, well, maybe not tigers, but we're certainly talking about lions and bears and maybe tigers. So, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about the Wizard of Oz. Lions and tigers and bears. Okay, so how are you on trivia?
Not very good.
Okay. Okay, so in the Wizard of Oz, who made more money performing in the movie? Was it A, the Munchkins, B, Toto, or C, the apple-throwing trees? Sorry.
The Munchkins, the dog, or the apple-throwing trees?
Yes.
I'm going to go with the dog, because that
You
just
are
seems
right.
so wrong.
Absolutely. Poor
So
Munchkins.
An interesting follow-up to this. About 10 years ago, I was on an airplane, and I sat down, and a shorter gentleman sat down next to me, and he was older and short, and he was a munchkin.
No way.
He was on his way to a Wizard of Oz festival, and he was one of the actual munchkins. And so I got to spend a flight talking to one of the munchkins.
Oh,
so
wow. Well,
there
I'm
you go.
glad he could.
He didn't bring up the dog pay issue,
Yeah,
but
I
I'm
was gonna
sure
say.
he wasn't happy about it.
I'm glad he could afford a flight. So, great. Okay. So, I don't know if you met any of these people, but who was the oldest actress in the movie? Was it Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, the Wicked Witch of the West, or Dorothy?
Ooh, I'm going to go, that was probably makeup. The Wicked Witch of the West was probably makeup. I'm going to go with Glinda, the Witch of the North.
You are right again. All right. Yeah, by like 30 years or something. She was way older. Okay, one last question. Magical snow fell on the poppies and made Dorothy and her friends fall asleep. What was it actually made of?
Is this
A?
multiple choice? Oh, good.
No, this is going to be multiple choice. But I bet you're going to guess. A, goose down, B, milkweed fluff, or C, asbestos?
That was what, 1930 something? I'm going
Yeah.
with asbestos.
You are right again.
There we go.
All right, Dave McFarland.
All right. Well, 3 for 3. I'll take it. Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. Happy to see such a good crowd. As Susan said, I did this about 5 years ago and came talk about wolves and wolf management at that time. And I tell people that this event is the most fun I've ever had in a public speaking engagement. And I really do enjoy this, and I'm really happy to be back. So thank you for inviting me, and thank you for showing up. So today is, I was asked to come and talk about our wildlife research program. The DNR has various research programs across the agency. I work in the Office of Applied Science, which is the research arm of the Division of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And so we as an office conduct research primarily on game species, game wildlife species, and on sport fish. And so as Susan said, science is alive and well. I think there was some misconceptions a few years ago that all the scientists were gone. We weren't gone, we were still there. And we've only grown since then. And right now our wildlife research team, who I work with, we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 30, 35 people that are working in our program right now. And that's everything from people like me and our research scientists, and then we also have seasonal technicians working on projects and tackling animals for us and things like that. It's mostly animal tackling. If you're interested, you can come apply. Well, we go through them pretty quick, so we need to replace people. So what do we do? I like to say we're in the information business. We provide scientific information to inform decision making within the agency. These management decisions, natural resource decisions, conservation decisions, they're incredibly complex. They're multifaceted. You've got the scientific information, you have the social context, you have different people who want to see different things, there's economics, there's all these different things that go into it. And what we do is provide that base scientific information. We provide that information we try to provide the best information we can on what's happening on the ground, what's happening with these wildlife populations, what's happening with the habitats that they use, so that at least that part is as solid as possible and can inform these very complicated decisions. And so we're not the policy people. We don't make the decisions on whether there should be more otters or less otters or whatever. We provide the information on how many otters are there, how many were there, how many are there likely to be in the future, so that people can base those decisions on that. If people have heard me speak before, you've probably heard this quote because I really like it and I think it's really pertinent to the work that we do. But Albert Einstein, he's also a scientist, you may have heard of him. He had more hair than I do, but so he was talking, and I think this was about a much more serious topic of nuclear weapons back at the time. But he was talking about the role of science in decision making, and he said that, see if I can get this right. Science is the study of what is, not what should be, and outside of its domain, value judgments of all kinds remain necessary. And I think that epitomizes the work that we do as scientists in the DNR. You know, I'll hear people say, well, you should do what the science says. Well, science doesn't really do that. That's not, science can't tell you that there should be more otters or there should be 0 otters. That's a value judgment. What we can do is tell you, here's how many otters there are, here's where they are, here's how they're doing, so that you can make those value judgments based on solid scientific information. So that's sort of the role of science in the agency, is to inform those decisions. We have, as Susan said, we have a number of different projects going on right now, somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 plus research projects all over the state on just about every species you can imagine, from prairie chickens to deer to bear to wolves to otters to name an animal. We're probably working on it. We also work on habitats and on wildlife habitats and how to improve wildlife habitat. Our research portfolio is based on the needs of the agency, and so we work with the agency to identify those decisions that are difficult to make because of a lack of. Oh, I went away. I will just talk louder. What? Nope. Okay. Oh, I'm back. I'm back. All right. And I completely lost my train of thought. Our priorities. Yeah, so we work with the agency. We identify these decisions that they need to make that they're having trouble with because they don't have good information to base the decision on. And so everything that we do as a research unit, this kind of makes us unique, working for an agency as opposed to, say, a university or some other area where people do research. Everything that we do is tied directly to a decision that needs to be made. Every project that we're working on, I can tell you what decision is going to be made based on the information that we produce. And for me, that makes it a really exciting place to work. You know, it's as scientists, you want your information to be used, and everything that we do is sort of predestined to be used. And if anything, we struggle with trying to hold back decision makers and be like, we're not ready yet, we're not ready yet. We'll have preliminary results, and you're like, all right, we're going to go with that. It's like, no, this is year 1 of 4. So anyway, with that as a preamble to what we do and how we do it, I'm going to give a really quick description of a few of the projects that we have going on. This will be way more interesting than what I just talked about. So I'm going to give a really quick description of a few of the projects that we have going on in this part of the world. And hopefully that will get everybody thinking about the critters that you're interested in and give you a better sense of what it is that we're working on. And then from there, we're going to open it up and see where we end up. So, sound good? All right. So I think in the title that I gave Susan when she invited me to do this, I titled this From Beaver to Bear. And so I'm going to start with beavers, and I'll end it with bears. And then there'll be a bunch of animals in between that were not in the title, and that'll be a surprise, and that'll be nice for you. So beavers. We have a couple of different projects focused on beavers, 2 actually. One is focused on beaver monitoring, and that project's pretty interesting. This is one of the issues that we're constantly dealing with within the agency is how to efficiently use resources. And efficiently use financial resources, in this case, natural resources too. But anyway, we had been monitoring beavers using a helicopter survey, and I'm really sad to see it go because it's the most fun I've ever had at work. We would fly around in helicopters and fly over beaver habitat and fly low and look for beaver colonies and identify colonies in set survey blocks. And then we had mathematical models that we used to extrapolate that out to a statewide population estimate, right? But flying helicopters is hugely expensive. It costs about $1,000 an hour to put a helicopter in the air. And there was a pilot in Wisconsin who had a helicopter who liked to do this work, and he would take us up basically for the cost of gas. And the last time, he was a great guy, great pilot. Last time I was up with him, I was talking to him about his flying career, and I said, "Oh, so where did you learn to fly?" And he said, "Well, in the Korean War." And he said, "And this is the last time I'll be doing this." So he's retired now, and so we put this this flight out for bid, and it came back. The winning bid was from South Carolina. It was going to be like $500,000 for them to come up, and we said, for beavers, that's hard to justify. We spend $500,000 on deer, with no problem. But for beaver, they're not really a very heavily managed species, and so we thought we really can't justify this. And then also, from my perspective, and for the rest of our staff, for the people that need to fly with these folks, you get up in the air, you're this high off the trees, you're this high off the water. You're like, "Oh, so you were the low bidder, huh?" so you really want to be in the air with the low bidder? So we decided that we'd look for other ways to do this. And so what we've been piloting, and this is actually working out really well, is a survey to trappers. And so rather than going up and flying around, we're relying on beaver trappers who are out on the landscape, and we're getting information from them. We send them a diary at the beginning of the year, and we say, "Okay, while you're out trapping, please fill this out." And they fill out the days in which they were out trapping, the number of trap sets that they had, and then how many animals they catch. And that gives us not a population estimate, but an index to population. And so in doing that, we've gone from something that was going to cost over somewhere in the neighborhood of $500,000 to something that we can do for a couple $1,000s a year. And so it's providing the information that we need to make the management decisions, and it's doing it much more efficiently. And so we're going to continue with that. And if at some point in the future we feel like we need to do something differently, then we'll address that at that time if we need more refined information on beavers. So that's beaver monitoring project. We also have a project looking at beaver and trout. In this part of the state, especially as you go further to the east, as you get into Forest Florence County, there's a lot of trout water over there. And there's some information that would suggest that beaver can be detrimental to trout. And that's some information that was gathered through research that was done 30, 40 years ago. And that work was used to design a statewide program for reducing beaver populations on trout water. And it's a wide-scale program, it's a costly program. But it's also removing a native wildlife species that has other ecological benefits. And so we've decided that we want to look at this again and say, okay, well, now that we're doing this at a much larger scale, let's look at beaver-trout interaction. So we've taken study streams across the state that are in the program where beaver are being removed and streams that are not in the program. And we're flipping those. And we're saying, okay, the ones where we have been removing beaver, some of them, so this is on like a handful of streams. So this isn't a statewide change in policy or anything. This is strictly for our research, where we're taking a handful of streams where beaver have been removed for decades, and we're going to stop removing beaver, let beaver recolonize, and see how the trout populations respond. We're then going to go to streams where we haven't been removing beaver, and we're going to start removing beaver and see how the trout population responds to see if we can better inform this pretty significant management action that's being taken on beaver to try to promote trout fishing. So that's another beaver project. I was told to only talk for 15 minutes, and I've probably already used that time, so I'm going to go faster. We also have a project looking at ringneck ducks. Ringneck ducks are a boreal species. They nest. We're sort of at the southern extent here in northern Wisconsin. We're at the southern extent of their breeding range, and they're a really important. Wisconsin is a really important component of the nesting range of ringneck ducks within the United States. And this is a great example of how we work across borders. Ducks, you kind of have to do that with ducks because they're constantly flying around. Much easier with like turtles. You don't have to worry about that. So, but we work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and with the Canadian government on these flyways. So we're within the Mississippi Flyway, and there's coordinated research and coordinated management across these flyways. and ringnecks were identified as a species with information needs. And so Minnesota did a study on ringneck ducks, and it showed that ringnecks were not doing very well there, and the nest success was low, and so then they said, okay, well, we really need to confirm, is this just a Minnesota thing or is it regional? And so we're doing a similar study here in Wisconsin. We started it this summer. They're notoriously difficult birds to study because they are at low densities and they nest right on the edge of these floating bog mats that are all over the place, so they're really hard to get to. This is why we need more technicians. They just fall into the box. And so actually, in order to get around that, we're using some really cool technology. We got a UAV, a drone, if you will. And so we have that, and this is so cool. We got this thing, and then we got an infrared camera that hangs off the bottom of it. And so we can, rather than sending, traditionally, if you were to do this, you'd send about 20 people out, and you'd walk in a line and try to find as many as you can by flushing these birds. Now we can take this piece of technology, fly it over. It looks for the thermal image. You can set the camera to the temperature of a duck, and it'll fly over, and everything's gray except for duck temperature things, which are sometimes ducks, there's sometimes rocks, there's sometimes other things, but sometimes they're ducks. And so we can fly over and we can find these things. And I wish I was told I couldn't do a PowerPoint. I'd have one slide, and it would be a picture of a glow-in-the-dark duck from our drone. But we can fly over and see these things, and it really improves our efficiency, and it's been a really neat project. So with that, we're getting nest success and survivorship and brood sizes and things like that, and we're going to compare that data to the data that was collected in Minnesota, and that's going to help inform management, not only in Wisconsin, but also across the central part of the continent, which is kind of cool. Another citizen science project that we have, Snapshot Wisconsin. This is the largest citizen science project that we have right now. We have over 1,700 volunteers involved in Snapshot Wisconsin. It's a program, anybody here, a Snapshot person? There we go, a few, at least 3. So there's 1,697 other people doing this, other than the people in the room. Actually, I'm a volunteer too, so this is a program where volunteers can get a trail camera to put on their property, and they're put out in a systematic way. All the cameras are identical, and they collect information in identical ways. And so we have a network of these. There's over 2,000 cameras all over the state, and we're only at about a third of the way to complete coverage. And so if anybody would like a camera, let me know. To date, we've collected over 35 million pictures of anything that walks in front of it. And so we're using this information, we're collecting information with trail cameras in a systematic way to generate data to help us monitor wildlife. And it provides some really simple information on some species, like range. For some species in the state, we really don't know where in the state they are and they aren't. So just by presence absence, we can identify that. But then for other species where we need to have a little bit more information, we're using it directly to generate population monitoring data. So for example, with deer, we're using the data coming from Snapshot to identify fawn to doe ratios, which fluctuate annually based on weather conditions, and are a critical component of our population models. And so it's providing valuable data there. We're using it to monitor prairie chickens. We're using it to get brood counts on turkeys. We're going to start using it to look at litter sizes in bears. So there's all sorts of things that we can do with this data, and it's really a neat program. It's become a model nationally. Other people are looking at this and saying, yeah, what Wisconsin's doing has some real potential. And so we're pretty excited about it. One of the projects that we're using Snapshot data on is to generate elk population estimates. So we have 2 elk populations in the state, one in the Clam Lake area, one down in Black River Falls in the Black River State Forest down there. And we're taking advantage of the fact that this elk population is relatively new. It's reintroduced, and so we have a really good idea of how many animals there are. And the population's growing. And we've been monitoring that population with a very hands-on approach of basically going out and being like, there's Bill the elk, there's Susie the elk, and that works when there's only a few of them. But as you get a larger and larger population, it gets more difficult. And so this really, and that's not actually how we do it. but it is very hands-on, and it's very much get out and monitor these elk so closely that you know how many there are. And as the population is growing, which is good, that's becoming more difficult to do, and we need to replace that with another method that's more efficient and more accurate at larger population sizes. And so we're taking advantage of the Snapshot Wisconsin data, taking advantage of the fact that we know almost exactly how many elk there are to develop these new models that will allow us to estimate populations from camera data. And if we can get it to work with elk, then we think that we can then apply that to other species where we don't have quite as good an idea of how many there are. So that's a pretty exciting project. Can't talk about wildlife research without talking about deer, and can't talk about deer in Wisconsin right now without talking about CWD. Our deer research right now is really focused on CWD. And that work isn't happening here, but it's pertinent to northern Wisconsin as we've had CWD showing up in Oneida and Lincoln counties and in other places in the area. So we have the largest wildlife research project that the state has ever undertaken is happening right now in the area around Dodgeville. And that's sort of in the heart of the core CWD area. We've been working down there for 3 years. We're about to start our fourth and final field season, and we're radio collaring deer. We're testing them at the time of capture to determine whether or not they're CWD positive or negative. And then we're looking at how those two groups, the positive and negative groups, what their fates are. You know, do they live or die? And it's a huge effort. To date, we've collared 548 adult deer. We've collared 323 fawns. We're also looking at the predators of deer. So we've collared 32 bobcats and 69 coyotes. And we're working with, right now we have 351 participating landowners who are allowing us to work on their properties. So it's a big effort. And we're looking at survival. And I can give you a hint on the results. You do not want to have CWD if you're a deer. You are far more likely to die. The survival rates are about half for CWD positive deer as they are for CWD negative deer. So we're looking at survival and mortality. We're looking at the population dynamics of the population. And we're looking at disease transmission and disease spread because we're testing these animals at the time of capture, and then also if we capture them subsequently or when they die, we test them again. And so those negative animals, we can see at what rate they're becoming positive, so we can learn more about how this disease is spreading. So in addition to that project, we also have a project looking at how to detect prions, how to test for them in the lab to try to get better ways to do that. We're looking at CWD prion persistence in soils to learn more about transmission, environmental transmission. And one of the big issues with CWD positive deer is they're difficult to dispose of. Excuse me. Waste management, landfills don't want to take these animals because they're worried about liability, that they could be liable if then CWD is found near their landfill. And so we're working on a composting project. There's some evidence that by composting deer, you can eliminate the CWD prion, and so we're working on that. Technicians for the CWD composting work? Yeah, that's not the job you want. Yeah, he's a great scientist at UW-Stevens Point, and he's working on that, and he's a specialist in animal composting, which is a fascinating line of research. It really is. It's super interesting how this all works. There's like composting things, and there's all these temperature probes, and we could talk a long time about composting later, but I'm going to move on to bobcats. We have bobcat research happening like right here. It's centered right in the Rhinelander-Minocqua area. For the last couple of years, we've collared 75 bobcats, which for bobcats is enormous, an enormous sample size. They're really difficult to catch. Usually when you look at studies of bobcats, the sample sizes are really small. But we've been working with trappers. So we sent a letter out to trappers and we said, hey, if you catch a cat that you choose not to or you cannot keep, give us a call. We'll come out and collar the animal. And it's worked great. So we just sit in our office, people call, hey, I have a cat. We run out and collar it. And it's a great way to involve trappers. It's a great way to involve citizens in our work. And it's also really efficient for us because rather than having a bunch of people driving around trying to catch these things themselves, people just call us and we collar them. So this study, was designed to look at survivorship of cats. And that's a really, so there's been a lot of questions about bobcat management in the state. We have relatively conservative harvest quotas for bobcats, and there's really long wait times to get a bobcat tag, and people wanted to have higher bobcat harvest. But we didn't know whether or not that would be possible, whether or not the cat population could sustain that. And so we collared all these cats, and we monitored their survival for a couple of years, identified what that was, and then we altered the management system. We doubled the harvest quota. And then we looked at survivorship after that change, and it didn't change at all. And so that told us it was about 70%, which is really good survivorship for an animal like that. And by increasing the quota, we didn't have any impact on survivorship at all. And so that told us that that was a sustainable harvest level, and we were able to maintain it. So that's been a really interesting project. It's still ongoing. We're about to finish that one up. Excuse me. Just real quick, and then we're going to get to bears. We do a lot of habitat work, and so we have a number of projects. We've been working with participants in our deer management assistance program. Amanda McGraw, who's here tonight, is running that project, looking at how the habitat on their land influences the health of the deer on their land, which has been really interesting. We've also been looking a lot at fire. Fire is a really important component of Wisconsin ecosystems, and we've been doing work to look at how to better use fire to meet our management objectives. And what we found is traditionally we've burned in the spring, and we were seeing a lot of woody growth, shrubs growing in our grasslands. And what we found through that work is by moving that burn to the summer, we can have a much greater impact. So we need to burn less frequently, and we get better results. So that's been really interesting work. And now I'm going to talk about bears. And I think I've gone over the time, so I apologize for that. Bears, I really like bears. I did my PhD on bears. I like bears. So we've got a really cool project going on right now on black bears in the state. Wisconsin has one of the highest density black bear populations on the continent. We've got a ton of bears, as anybody who lives here knows. So we're really, well, depends on your perspective. From my perspective, we're really lucky to have this bear population. If you have your trash cans knocked over all the time, you might think differently. But we have a large bear population, but we also manage that population very tightly. It's a very tightly managed population. There's a ton of interest in bear hunting in Wisconsin. We get somewhere in the neighborhood of 120,000 applications for bear hunting licenses every year. And bear hunting participation nationwide is declining. If you look at trends in duck licenses and deer licenses and everything else, almost everything's declining. Bear licenses are going up every year, or bear permit applications are going up every year. So it's a really interesting sort of different trend here. And so we get 120 applicants, and we give out about 13,000 tags. And so the wait times are really long. We harvest somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000, 4,500 bears a year. It's one of the highest harvests anywhere in the country. It is the highest harvest anywhere in the country. We harvest more bears than they do in Alaska. Alaska's big. So we really need to know, this is one of those species, the opposite of beaver, where I said maybe we don't need to have quite as high resolution information. This is one that we really need to have a good idea on. And so we do periodic high resolution estimates of bears. And we did that this year in a different way than we've done it in the past. We did it, or we're doing it, it's not done yet, but we're doing it using genetics, which is a new thing for us. The cost of genetics has come way down, and so it's become a tool that's affordable to use at a statewide scale. And so this summer, we put out 844 hair snares all over bear range across 32 counties. And these things are, we went with barbed wire, found 3 trees, put a barbed wire corral around it, And then this is where the real scientific part comes in. Bears like peanut butter. Um, and so we mixed peanut butter with cooking oil to make a slurry and dumped that in a hole in the ground in the center of this thing to create a scent attractant, but importantly, something that they wouldn't get excited about. So the goal was to have a lot of disappointed bears, and I think we pulled it off. And so we buried this stuff so the bears wouldn't really get, like if you put a pile of donuts or something, they'll come back and come back and come back, and that would screw us up. And so we did that around the state, and then we monitored those sites for 4 weeks. And we looked at, we collected every hair that got deposited on the barbed wire. And then by looking at 4 different times, we were able to see how often they came back, and then importantly, how often they were detected at 2 different sites. And now the data's all at the lab. We got over 7,000 hair samples, and it's all at a lab in Pennsylvania. And they're going to analyze that, give us the individual IDs, and then we can look and see how many animals we found, how many animals we recaptured multiple times, and then the movement rate of these animals. And from that, and I won't describe the math, because I wasn't allowed to use a PowerPoint. But from that, we can calculate the number of activity centers and the density of bears around each of these clusters of sites, and we can extrapolate that to a statewide population estimate. So it's really cool work. And for me, again, working for an agency like the DNR is really cool. There's some, there's things I mentioned before, how all of our work sort of plugs right into decision making. This is another thing that's really cool as a scientist, is the stuff that we can pull off, because we're such a big agency and we have a big staff and we can mobilize those resources to be able to go, and we put out in 2 weeks, we put 844 hair snares out across 2/3 of the state. And as a scientist, that's like, you can't do that. Like that's not possible, but you can when you work for a place like DNR. So I think it's a really cool example of what we can do as an agency. We can do these really big, audacious projects and pull them off, and that's really fun to see when everybody pulls together and does that. And so with that, I think despite the request to only talk for 15 minutes, you got, I think, 30. But I think I brought us from beavers to bears, and I'll shut up and take any questions. So.
Do bobcats prey on turkeys, and do they have a substantial effect on the numbers?
Bobcats, well, cats in general are very efficient predators. Anybody who has a house cat knows that. They'll kill string. So, but they're very efficient predators, and they're very opportunistic. And so, yes, they will take a turkey if they have the opportunity. In terms of population level effects on turkeys, we haven't looked at that directly, but my presumption would be that the predation rate would be relatively low. They don't really specialize on turkeys. They're more most of the diet of bobcats is smaller mammals, and so I wouldn't expect that they have a significant impact on turkey populations. What's that? Where? No, they primarily hunt on the ground. Yeah. Yeah.
On the turkey note, have we seen a big impact of the eastern turkey on ruffed grouse population? Because I've noticed on my property that we used to have tons of ruffed grouse on it. Now we have virtually no grouse and a large amount of turkeys.
Yeah. So turkey populations have been going up.
And no tags given out.
So yeah, turkey populations have been going up. Can be hard to get a tag. But there's no evidence that they're directly impacting grouse. We are looking. Grouse, there have been some anomalies in the grouse population, and we've been looking at that. Specifically, there's a lot of interest in West Nile virus and whether or not that's having an impact. And so we've been working with grouse hunters to have hearts submitted when they harvest a grouse, and we've been analyzing those for West Nile virus, and there is evidence that there is exposure West Nile virus in the grouse population. This is something that's being looked at not only in Wisconsin but across grouse range. It's first looked at in Pennsylvania, and so we're trying to figure out what's going on with the grouse population. We don't quite have it nailed down yet, but I think the relationship between turkey and grouse is just a coincidental thing, not a direct competition between them.
Question online?
Oh.
Yes, we have a question from the library. Are you doing any research on the theory that deer are eating too much corn and it's causing trouble, giving them diabetes and possibly resulting in chronic wasting disease?
Well, first off, hello to the library. I forgot the. Hi, library. So we're not directly looking at that question. We don't have any studies that are directly looking at deer diet. And I'm not aware of a connection between corn consumption and diabetes or CWD infection. So.
Yeah, there was one species that you haven't mentioned yet, and I know you know a little bit about them, and that would be wolves. 2 years ago, we went on a Natural Resources Foundation wolf howl field trip with you, like we were talking a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
But can you do like a quick Reader's Digest version of how are wolves doing, maybe both politically and biologically in survival, their survival in Wisconsin and maybe Minnesota too, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. Politically, they're having a hard time. They have yet to be elected to office anywhere where they've run. So they keep trying. There's a wolf pack out there, I think. I had to do it. So, all right. So, how are wolves doing? Wolves. The wolf population in Wisconsin is strong. There's just under 1,000 wolves at our last count, and we do a overwinter minimum count, and so that's the population. Every wildlife population does this, and we happen to count wolves at the bottom of the trough, and then almost immediately after we count them, the population doubles when the pups are born, and the population declines again. And so that overwinter count is just under 1,000 right now. They're federally protected under the Endangered Species Act, and they have been since the end of 2014. And so under that designation, the management authority for wolves rests with the federal government, not with the state. And so the management options that the state has are constrained by the regulations of the Endangered Species Act. And essentially, it precludes any lethal management. And so, with very few exceptions, human health and safety issues and things like that, which are extraordinarily rare with wolves. But it does constrain our management actions, and that can lead to some frustration. Wolves, like every other wildlife species, have the potential to have positive interactions with people and negative interactions with people. And with wolves, especially when they get into livestock predation situations, that can be incredibly frustrating for farmers. It could be economically devastating in certain places. And so there's frustration that in those cases, the management options are limited to alleviate that problem. So that's a little bit of the politics and a little bit of the population. It's really interesting to watch with wolves. It's going to be interesting here over the next couple of years because the wolf population, we've had wolves in the state since the Ice Age, but then they were gone for a while. Then they came back. They're actually only gone for about 10 years, which is interesting. But anyway, they came back in the mid-1970s. And so the population was kind of bouncing around at a low level, and then about the mid-90s, it really started to grow. And we've been waiting to see where it's going to stop growing. And there's some evidence that that's maybe starting to happen. And so it's going to be interesting over the next couple of years to see if it goes much above 1,000. I don't think anybody really knows. I think in northern Wisconsin, there's pretty good evidence that the population that's here is about what it can be. Any population growth is happening through expansion of the wolf range further to the south. And that's limited by habitat and by human population densities and things like that. And so it's going to be really interesting to watch that play out. So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah, and the wolf howls are a lot of fun. If anybody, the Natural Resource Foundation, we do a field trip with them every year. We go out and howl for wolves in the summer, and it's super fun. So.
I was wondering, in regard to your statement about the beavers and the trout, does the association come with the damming of the stream? Is that how it's affecting the trout?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, beavers are incredible animals, right? I mean, they wouldn't. Well, every animal has an influence on its ecosystem, but beavers like completely transform it. They're like, I don't want a stream, I would like a pond. So they're out there like little aquatic rodent gods changing the earth. But the interaction between beaver and trout is, it's really interesting, and it depends on the stream that you're on. And so if you go out west, they actually promote beaver on trout streams because those streams are very cold and they run very fast. And so by having beaver in those systems, you're slowing the water down, you're allowing it to warm, and it's better for trout. And so actually, this is a little aside, there's a paper that I found. It's my favorite paper I've ever found. And it was from maybe the 60s. And they were trying to reintroduce beaver into western mountain systems in order to benefit trout and things. And so they devised a plan to put beaver in these little boxes and parachute them out of airplanes. And so they designed this thing so that it would land and it would automatically open. And in order to test that, they had one beaver, and they dropped him like 50 times from this thing. and you know, it was mostly, they knew the parachute would work. They were mostly trying to get it to open and make sure the beaver would like actually like, and so they finally perfected it. And then they released this beaver, this like super beaver that had earned his wings. And then they went back and they checked on where they dropped him a couple years later, and there's this huge beaver colony. And so anyway, he lives happily ever after. It's the best scientific paper I've ever seen. So I'm totally off on a tangent here. I apologize. So that's sort of the Western context. In where we are, the streams are low gradient, right? So they're, we don't have a huge amount of topography compared to Colorado. And so they're low gradient, they're relatively slow moving. Some of the streams are right at that borderline of trout temperature. And so there's some thinking there's some evidence that the damming that beavers do is leading to a warming of water temperatures and is preventing movement of trout up and downstream. And this is really important. We have some systems like the bigger systems like the Pine and the Popple and those streams. Parts of those streams get thermally, it's thermally not possible for trout to survive there during the summer months, and so they need access to these tributaries that stay cold. And so if you're restricting movement, then you can have problems there. So that's kind of the theory behind this. But then there's also evidence that there's sort of other elements at play. So for example, when you dam a stream, you're allowing for more groundwater recharge, and that can allow for more upwelling downstream, and that may have the opposite thermal effect. And so we may not be looking at this holistically enough to just look at the water coming out of the dam, because that may be offset by other forces. And then there's also some other evidence that these deep water pools can be beneficial. We really don't know what's happening, and so we're researching it. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, it's a complicated issue.
I'm curious about drone usage, and for instance, I don't know, 25 years ago when they were so worried about the eagles, and I had an eagle tree on my property, and I had DNR guys out there climbing adjacent trees to try and see how many eggs there were and who survived, etc. But it seemed like with eagles or beavers or all kinds of animals that drone technology should greatly simplify things.
Yeah, we hope so. We're we're kind of a test case. I think we have the first one in the agency, and so there's a lot that goes into using technology like this, especially when you work for the government. You know, it's like you're flying cameras around, people get freaked out. And so there's been a lot of work within the agency to make sure that the policies are in place to make this work. And so this is the first time that we've used it, but we see a ton of potential for wildlife research. We're planning to use it this spring on our beaver project. We need to survey these streams, and so you could send a bunch of people on a big long hike through the woods to look at beaver dams along the stream, or you could fly this thing and get it done in a fraction of the time. And so we think there's a lot of efficiency to be gained, which is good for everybody, good for us, and good for you because you pay us. So there's a lot of efficiency to be gained, but then there's also a lot that we can do with this that we couldn't do in other ways, and so we're trying to explore that. For example, what I said with the ducks, with this thermal camera, there's no other way to do that, and so it's kind of neat to see some of those things, and we think there's potential for density estimates for other species. There's a need for, we've been thinking about trying to develop ways to do really fine-scale estimates of deer populations, especially when we have disease outbreaks. Our population monitoring for deer is at the county scale, but when we have a disease outbreak, there's a need to say, okay, within a mile of this, how many deer are there? And we don't have a good way to do that. We think there might be some potential there, and then also with these rare species like eagles, and eagles aren't so rare anymore, I guess, which is good. But with some of these sort of specialized things where you might be able to use it. So it's a new piece of equipment. We're still learning how to use it, and I think there's a lot of potential. What's that? Yeah, realtors. I mean, they're used all over the place. So as usual, we're probably a little late to the party, but I think there's a lot that we can do with it.
Drones are cool. Anyways, my question is back to the beaver.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of philosophical evidence on the impact a beaver has in an ecosystem, especially in old growth, and erosion, especially on the shoreline. Mm-hmm. Is there any credible evidence to that you can throw into that mix and share with us?
Yeah, well, so we're specifically looking at impacts of beaver on trout, but beavers cause all sorts of impacts. So yeah, there's impacts on timber, and so there is some beaver control done for timber protection, because if a beaver dam goes in and it floods a huge area, it's going to kill all those trees, and so that's certainly an impact.
Does it support old growth?
Do beavers support growth?
Old growth trees. So timber would be like a new growth.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, so if beavers are flooding an area, they're going to kill the trees, old or new growth. In terms of beavers promoting old growth or supporting old growth, I guess I haven't looked into that specifically. There may be, some associations where, again, with groundwater recharge, there may be some benefits to trees and things like that. But I guess I haven't looked directly at the connection between old growth and beavers. But I mean, they do a ton of good. I mean, every time there's a beaver dam, that's frog habitat, and newt habitat, and ducks, and everything else. I mean, they create these little pockets of habitat, which are pretty are beneficial for a lot of species. And so that's what I think the challenge is how do you, as with any animal has positives and negatives associated with it. And so how do we balance the positives and the negatives? And in order to do that, we need to understand what those are. And that's what we're trying to do, at least with this trout project, but we're not looking directly at relationship with trees.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for coming. You have alluded a little bit to the way that resources have limited the questions that we can answer and the way we can answer those questions. In your dream world, unlimited resources, what project would you love to see undertaken?
There's always going to be resource limitations, but one thing I will say is that we have a tremendous amount of support within the agency, and the challenge that we have right now, and this is a good problem to have, is that we have more need and resources than we have the staff to do. And so in some ways, what we're limited by is what we can do as a team. And so to get around that, one thing I haven't talked enough about is our collaborations. And so we fund a ton of research all over the place. We fund research with, I guess I talked about UW-Stevens Point, the composting project. We have a number of projects with UW-Madison. We support graduate students. We have master's students, PhD students, postdocs who are working on projects that we're funding. We work with the USGS Co-op unit at UW-Madison, the Wildlife Research Co-op unit. We work with the National Wildlife Health Center, which is based in Madison, conveniently. And so, I mean, there's the DREAM project. I think in my opinion, we're doing some of those DREAM projects. Like this deer project that we're doing, it's the biggest project. I've never seen a wildlife project this big. And it's asking a question on probably the most pressing wildlife issue in the country, in the world maybe, is the CWD issue is really important. It's important for wildlife. It's important for the funding model for wildlife conservation in the United States. The United States funding model for wildlife conservation is based on hunting license sales. And the vast majority of hunting license sales are on ungulates. And ungulates are the ones that are impacted by CWD. And so as ungulate populations are impacted by CWD, and then as hunter perceptions of whether or not they want to hunt in places where there is CWD impacts harvest opportunities, it impacts the ability to fund wildlife conservation at large, not just deer. Deer are it's sort of like a college sports program, right? Like you get to have a crew team because you have a football team. Like we get to have bat conservation because we have deer hunting. And so it's, I think that's a really important thing, and I mean, it's an enormous project, and it's really well resourced, and so I actually feel pretty good about where we are. I mean, I try not to be greedy. I mean, if anybody wants to give us more money, we'll take it. But I actually feel, I feel like we're really well supported by our agency.
A question here?
So it's kind of there's two different questions. First one is, other states that I've hunted in, when you ask them about CWD, Missouri, Texas, Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, Kentucky, CWD is hardly on their radar compared to EHD. We finally, this year in southern Wisconsin, had EHD come into the state and absolutely devastate the area that it was found in. Why have we been spending so much money since, for almost 2 decades now on CWD research? We really know very little more than we did then. And now we have this EHD, which we've kind of seen on the horizon, kind of coming from other states and working its way slowly from that Missouri, that Kansas, Texas, all the way up through Iowa into Wisconsin now. Have we done anything to combat EHD versus CWD, and where other states don't worry about it compared to how we worry about it?
Okay, there was a lot there. So the reason that the states with EHD worry about EHD is because they have EHD. The reason that states with CWD worry about CWD is because they have CWD. And so we've been worried about CWD because we have it. Missouri hasn't been because they didn't. Now they are because they've got it. And so they've got a really aggressive CWD management program. I was actually at a meeting just a couple weeks ago with people from Missouri on CWD. They're taking the issue very seriously. Same with Texas. CWD is spreading. It's spreading quickly. It's in 26 states now, and every state that has it is taking it seriously.
Missouri hasn't tested for it until like 6 years ago.
Correct.
Can you repeat that?
Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, Missouri.
We didn't find it until we decided that we were going to test for it. We probably had it long before then.
Correct. Yeah, there's some evidence that we had it before we started testing for it. Missouri found it a few years ago after they started testing for it, and now they have a very active CWD program. But part of it is, we found it. Now we have sex and age classes in the core CWD area that have close to 50% prevalence rates. Every other deer has CWD in those sex and age classes. I mean, if you look at the prevalence rates, it's a exponential curve. That's why we're taking it seriously. Yeah, we had EHD. EHD is transmitted by a midge, and it's rare in Wisconsin. And when it comes in a wave. It's devastating when it does come, but then it goes, and it's not persistent, and it can come back. But at this point, it's not the primary threat that CWD is. CWD, it doesn't go away, and every state that's gotten it has taken it seriously. It's a significant issue, and that's why we're allocating resources to it. I think understanding what the impact of the disease is going to be is critical. Also critical is understanding how to control it when it shows up in new places. So we have an endemic area of CWD now in the state. That part of the state in the southwest part where we have these really high prevalence rates, CWD is going to be there. There isn't a reasonable management action that could be taken to eliminate CWD from that part of the state. When we have a deer, or now 4 deer, in the Oneida County, Lincoln County area down by the river there, that's a place where we can still take management action. And by understanding the dynamics of the disease, we can come into a place like northern Wisconsin, and when it shows up, try to take management action to eliminate it. And because it is this persistent disease, I think it's really critical, and it makes it different than a disease like EHD that kind of comes and goes. So I'm not saying that EHD isn't important. It's a lot more prevalent in warmer climates. And so in places like Texas, it's a bigger deal than it is here. So I don't want to say one's more, like, minimize one over the other, but I think that it's, CWD is a significant issue. It has the potential to significantly impact deer populations. It significantly impacts hunter behavior. There's a less than zero risk of human health issues. That's why the CDC and the National Institutes of Health are taking it seriously. So it's a big deal, and so I think it's appropriate, the agency's response to make it a priority. I think it's appropriate. Ooh, it's hemorrhagic disease, and the E stands for something. Did I mention I'm a bear specialist? Yeah, it's something. There we go. There we go.
Could you please comment on the status of mountain lions in Wisconsin? Are there any breeding pairs?
Mountain lions. We didn't talk about mountain lions yet. Cougars. Everybody's other favorite critter. So I could do a whole talk on mountain lions. They're also really neat animals. So mountain lions in Wisconsin. Do we have them? Yes. We have at any given time, I'd say there's between 1 and 5 mountain lions in Wisconsin. I have no idea. That's based on nothing. So, but other than a well-informed guess. No, based on, we occasionally get confirmed mountain lion sightings, primarily from trail cameras. With the ubiquity of trail cameras right now, we can actually track individual lions. And if you go to our website, you can play along with us, because we've shown that we have maps of, this lion was caught on this camera, and we had one. This was a couple years ago. There was one in Elko, just south of here, and we got it on a camera, and then had another camera sighting of one that was about 20 miles away the next day, and then 10 days later it was about 50 miles later, and so you can almost track these individual animals as they go through. So we don't have many. We do not have any evidence of a breeding population. We've never actually, of the animals that we've been able to identify the sex of the animal, which is not all of them, but of the ones that we've identified the sex, we've never had a female. Females are very important to a breeding population. So we've never identified a female in the state. From what we know, not only from mountain lions that have been identified in Wisconsin, but also those that have been identified in neighboring states, is essentially what's happening is the furthest west established population of mountain lions is in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And if you've been to the Black Hills, Mount Rushmore, there's other stuff there too. But, the Black Hills is sort of island, right? And it's surrounded by the plains and the Badlands and things like that. And so that population of mountain lions is pretty well saturated. And so they're sending out dispersers at a pretty high rate because there's no habitat or there's no room for those animals there. And so if you go further west, they are getting female dispersers. But the male dispersal distance is a lot longer than the female dispersal distance in mountain lions. And so as far as we know, we're beyond the known dispersal distance of females. And so these males are coming through, looking for other mountain lions and ending up in Wisconsin. And so most of them are not establishing from our ability to track them, which is limited. They're not staying in one place, they're moving through. And the most dramatic example of that is an animal that was, this was 10 plus years ago, 15 years ago. There was an animal that was identified in Minnesota, and it was, genetics were taken from it. It was then identified a couple of times in Wisconsin genetically. It was the same animal. And then it disappeared. And then about a year later, somebody in New York said, a farmer in the Buffalo area said, a mountain lion just ran through my field. And whoever in New York said, there hasn't been a mountain lion in New York for years. That wasn't a mountain lion. He said, well, I got hair from it, from the barbed wire fence. Do you want it? And they said, no, there's no mountain lions here. Okay. So then about a year later, an animal got hit by a car in southern Connecticut. A mountain lion got hit by a car in southern Connecticut. And so they had identified, they thought it was probably an escaped pet. Some people have pet mountain lions. That's a whole different story. But interestingly, the captive mountain lion population is of South American genetics. And so you can easily identify captive versus wild cats, unless you're in South America, maybe, I don't know. So they identified this animal, and it came back as the same animal as was found in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And then they called that farmer back, and they said, you still have that hair? And he did, and it was the same animal. And so it's actually the longest documented dispersal of a terrestrial mammal anywhere in the world was that animal. And what's really fascinating to me is this animal, came presumably from Black Hills, genetically matched Black Hills population. We don't know that's where it came from, but genetically. We know it was in Minnesota. We know it was in Wisconsin. Based on the trajectory in Wisconsin, it was pointed towards the UP. And then it showed up in the Buffalo area, so maybe it went through southern Ontario, which is the most densely populated part of Canada, went through New York, where it got hit by a car was just outside of New York City. And so it went presumably down like the Hudson River Valley, and then into like southern Connecticut and got hit by a car. That's the most densely populated area in the United States, or one of, and it wasn't seen until it hit the front of a car. So pretty incredible for a giant cat. But anyway, so that's a little bit on mountain lions. Yeah.
Talk a little bit about citizen science and what impact, what significance it has, pros and cons, whatever.
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about some of our citizen science projects. Citizen science is this tremendous opportunity. We try to incorporate people of the state into our projects as much as we can, and that's for a number of reasons. I'd like to say it's all for altruistic reasons, but a lot of it's very selfish. We get a lot out of it. Like I said with our Bobcat project, by incorporating trappers, we are getting all of these cats basically for free. Trapping an animal, just trapping an animal for these carnivore trapping efforts costs us between $2,000 and $3,000 per animal in staff time, mileage, and that's just to get the animal in hand. And then you got to put a collar on it, and that doesn't include all of that. And so, every time we can incorporate people into that kind of thing, it really is beneficial to us. But I also think there's a lot of value in, especially when we're, as a government agency, incorporation of people into the science that we do is really important. I think it provides credibility. It provides an opportunity for the citizens of the state. Again, we work for you, and so it provides an opportunity for people who are interested to be involved in the work that we do, which a lot of people are interested in doing. It provides credibility because when it's when it's your friends and neighbors who collected the data, you know, people are more likely to believe it than when, you know, the DNR goes out and does something. So there's all sorts of benefits to it, and you know, it's something that we've been trying to incorporate as much as we can into the work that we do. There are challenges with it. There's times when it's not the most suitable tool. When you have a citizen science project, most of them are individuals doing a small part of a big thing. And so in situations where having 1,000 people collecting information can cause problems, that would be true whether it's citizens or staff, right? When you've got these really complicated things that need to be done exactly right, it can be a challenge to work with that many people. Sometimes we do have, you know, citizen science projects where there's like 5 people that are really dedicated to it, and that can work in those situations. So it's not right for everything, but when it works, it can be great. And yeah, so I mean, we try to at least have that conversation with almost all of our projects of how can we involve people in this? Is there a way that we can do it? So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
Another question here.
All right.
Anyone can sign up for citizen science too. You just need an email address and you set up a password. You can use your smartphone or a computer, and there's several projects that could cater to whatever you're interested in, whether it's migratory birds or the butterflies or the flowers growing in your yard or the mushrooms popping up in your compost. Sorry.
Do you believe that the baiting ban that's been in, I think, 52 counties in Wisconsin is beneficial to the CWD? Because the southern part of the state hasn't had baiting almost since day one, since they found out that it was there. So, and it seems to still be just as prevalent down there as ever. Some people argue that baiting actually gives more sites for the deer to eat from, so they're not chewing off the same browse, they're not chewing off the same corn stalk in other areas.
So the theory behind baiting bans, right? CWD transmits through direct contact between deer. And so if they exchange saliva, if they you know, are eating on top of feces, things like that. So by reducing direct contacts, you are reducing disease transmission. This is disease 101, right? Like if somebody has a cold and they wipe their nose and reach into the bag of M&Ms, do you want to reach into the bag of M&Ms? No. So, you know, it's the same theory. You know, we all sort of impose our own baiting and feeding bans at home when somebody has a cold, right? So it's reducing contact rates for disease transmission. And it's fundamentally different when you have a pile of corn versus a forest. And so if you've got deer all coming in and eating out of the same pile of corn, the transmission or the contact rates are likely to be higher than they are when they are, you know, foraging naturally. So that's the theory behind it. And a lot of this is precautionary principle, right? You know, we still are learning about transmission of CWD. We're still learning about how this works. And so it's taking things that we know can increase a known transmission pathway and trying to reduce that on the landscape.
I have to hear you though.
They
So
won't
on
be
a
able to
si-
hear you at the library without the mic.
So on a side note, the DNR, when we did have baiting and CWD was in southern parts of the state, it was mandatory that you baited in a pile. And most of the hunters were saying, no, we should broadcast it so that way the deer are not eating over the same pile. So they are spread out over separate areas. Now, wouldn't that be kind of the same thing if they were to broadcast it in separate areas? The deer would not be eating off the same browse. They'd not be eating off the same pile. They'd be eating one kernel of corn spread out into the middle of leaves, whatever it may be. Would that be a bonus to the baiting to help out with keeping them from eating off the same piles and still producing more feed for the deer to help?
Well, I mean, the safest thing is to just not have it, you know? And the other thing, anytime that we have a regulation, we need to think about enforcement. And so what is spread out is that spread out enough? Those become regulatory issues, enforcement issues. And so, again, based on what we know about disease transmission, eliminating ways that deer can congregate is going to be theoretically beneficial, and that's the justification for those regulations.
I just have a quick question about bats. I have not seen a bat at our house for the last several years, and we
Yeah.
used to have them roosting, and every night sitting on the dock, we would see bats flying over the water, and we haven't had any bats. Can you give us a little update on white nose syndrome and where our bats are at?
Yeah, bats. I actually was thinking about that this summer when I was a kid. My brothers and I would go out and we'd throw pebbles in the air and just, have 15 bats all come and congregate at that pebble. And I've not done that with my children because that's not a thing anymore, and it's kind of sad. And I saw a bat this summer, and the fact that I have to say I saw a bat this summer is devastating. It's sad, right? Yeah, so white nose syndrome has devastated bat populations where it's been found, and Wisconsin's had white nose for a few years now, and it's been problematic. It's still in the state. It's still impacting the state. We're actively researching it. My group doesn't work in that area, so I'm not really familiar with the work that's going on. But I know that our Natural Heritage Conservation, which is our endangered resources program, they're actively engaged with it. And actually, one of the real centers for research on white nose syndrome nationally is the National Wildlife Health Center, which is in Madison. And I was actually, last week, 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting with them, and they were just giving an overview of a number of their projects. And they were talking about some of the things that they're doing. They're working on vaccines, and they're working on identifying cave microbiomes that may be more resistant to white nose syndrome so like the microbes in the soil in the cave. And then they're also looking at treatments for infected bats. So there's a ton of work going on. Unfortunately, there isn't a silver bullet yet, but we'll see what happens. There's some encouraging signs from New York, which is where white nose was first discovered, that some of those populations may be building resistance and bouncing back just on their own. Just genetically, they've built some level of resistance, and there's some like glimmers of hope, but I don't have really good news on white nose, other than to commiserate with you that I also miss the bats.
You said that one of the main ways that CWD travels is through saliva. It's Dr. Kroll, right? He's done a lot of research on CWD since the 70s. Is that?
I don't know that he's done much research on it.
According to him, he said he's the lead researcher. But I mean, again, that's through him.
According to me, I'm the lead of a lot of stuff.
Yeah. Well, he said that he has specifically taken saliva from deer back and forth and could not get CWD to travel through saliva. The only way he could get it to travel back and forth was taking a minimum of 200 milliliters of blood from one that has it to another and transfer it. So I guess I'm just asking your opinion. Is that false?
That would be a unique opinion amongst the scientific community.
I'm listening to a guy who said he's from the 70s, who's been doing CWD since the beginning.
That would be, he is...
You can tell me he's wrong. It's okay.
Yeah, every other CWD scientist who's looked at this would tell you that that's not accurate. We know that CWD, it transmits between animals. We know that it transmits from...
Sorry, well, what other animals does it pass through?
Between individual deer.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that's, it's that contact that is transmitting deer. And then we're also starting to look at environmental transmission, so environmental contamination and how that can transmit the disease. If what it required was 200 milliliters of direct transfusion, deer don't do that to themselves frequently. Right.
But that can be a possibility through deer eat. Sorry, deer do eat ticks off each other. That would be a lot of ticks.
Right.
But I'm just saying.
What we know is that the transmission mechanism is easy enough that where CWD becomes established, the prevalence rates get very high very quick. And if it was difficult to transmit the disease, that wouldn't be the case. If it's easy to transmit the disease, you'd expect infection rates to increase. And that's what we're seeing. So we may not know exactly how it transmits, but what we know is that it's transmitting easily enough that in our population, in the core of the CWD area, the prevalence rates are getting extraordinarily high. And if it was difficult to transmit the disease between animals, it wouldn't be that high. And we see that in human diseases. You know, when the flu comes through, really easy to transmit. And it wipes through our population, and suddenly everybody has the flu. Diseases that are more difficult to transmit are much more rare.
I was intrigued when we were talking about the bats and the fungal disease in white nose syndrome, et cetera. And, you know, I've read over the years that fungal diseases, we don't think about them much. You know, we worry about bacteria and viruses and Ebola and whatever. But, and especially, and I don't know what you could say about this, but especially with climate change and warming, fungal diseases are going to become more and more prevalent because as you warm up, athlete's foot likes warm feet, you know, and they're going to become much more of a threat. And so climate change is a big risk factor, not just for white nose syndrome, but histoplasmosis, blastomycosis, coccidioidomycosis, all these incredibly deadly, horrible fungal diseases. But so are you allowed, I guess, to make a comment on climate change and its potential impact?
I am allowed to say climate change.
Well, that's progress.
And the Wisconsin DNR is re-engaging with the Wisconsin Impacts on Climate Change Initiative along with UW. And so, yeah, we're back in the climate game as an agency. And I know nothing about fungal diseases. So I'm not a disease specialist. I'm not we'd need to have a disease ecologist here to talk about the specifics of that. So, yeah, sorry, I can't address that directly. Yeah.
Are deer farms still allowed in Wisconsin?
Yes.
And Texas has a lot of deer farms, and they have a real problem with CWD.
I guess I can't speak specifically to Texas, but yeah, and CWD has been found in deer farms around the country, including in Wisconsin. And so there are policies in place when CWD is found in a deer farm. That's regulated by the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. It's not regulated by the DNR. And so, but there are policies that respond when there's positives. There's also movement restrictions that have been placed on how deer can be moved between facilities. And so, there is the potential anytime there's animals moving around the landscape and they can be positive, that is a potential risk, but there are policies in place to try to minimize that risk. But there are still captive service facilities in the state. So.
Yeah, I'm curious about our moose population. Like, what are the numbers? Where are they located?
Moose.
Yeah, do we have any of those?
They all got eaten by the mountain lions. That's why there's none of either. No, there's. We have a occasional and transient moose population in the state. They just kind of come and go, and so actually right around here is one of the places that we frequently have sightings. Maybe some of you have seen moose in the state. I've seen moose tracks. I've never actually seen a moose in Wisconsin, but maybe I'll see one day. But there's, to our knowledge, we don't have much of a population at all. It's really just occasional sightings here and there. And what we do end up having is we do have, especially bull moose, ending up in an area and maybe being there for several years, and then disappearing or dying or whatever. But we really don't have a very large moose population. Moose aren't doing so well in Minnesota and in the UP, and we're royally at the fringes of moose range, and so it's not looking too good for a robust, established moose population in the state. So, yeah,
Have you had any moose necropsy reveal brainworm?
I don't know of any specifically. We haven't necropsied very many moose. Brainworm, though, is an issue for moose in our neighboring states. So there's a brainworm that impacts cervid populations, and white-tailed deer can carry it, but they're not really negatively impacted by it, but it does impact moose negatively. And so in places where you have moose and deer interacting, this disease can cause problems for moose. And so we haven't really looked at that directly. I mean, honestly, we have so few moose in the state, we don't really do much with moose other than, along with all of you, say, whoa, a moose. We write it down. So we haven't really done too much. We did necropsy one. There was one hit by a car, by a really small car up by Eagle River a couple years ago. You do not want to hit a moose. And some work was done on that, but I don't know if brainworm was identified in it. But they've been looking at that question a lot in Minnesota, especially northern Minnesota. The moose population's been declining, and they've been looking at causes of that. And it looks like it's a combination of some brainworm issues and then some climactic issues where the temperature in the summer is getting too warm for moose. So.
Any others? Do you have any?
Oh, I think you got one more back there. We'll make this the last question.
Look at that. You guys did well. It is. We got 1 minute left. You hit it right on the nose.
So there have been a lot of questions, if you had your pick of a research project, what it would be, and you've talked about all the many hands that make things work. And so you talked about a lot of the principal investigators that are involved, and you've mentioned seasonal staff, but I guess I've heard through the grapevine that there are a lot of folks also who make that happen in between who might not be seasonal, and just kind of thinking so in terms of the wildlife program, wildlife research, how many permanent staff are there? How many seasonal people do you have? And are there people in between that make the gears work to try to get this all done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly didn't mean to leave anybody out. We have an incredible staff in our wildlife research. Now I get to brag a little bit about the team, which is great. So we have an incredible staff in our wildlife research team. We have an incredible staff in the DNR. It's a really cool place to work. Just for the people that we get to work with, I really feel lucky to work there, and especially in the team that I get to work with. But we have a great group of people, and we have, I think, what you're alluding to is the DNR's way of hiring between, we have FTEs, full-time employees, and LTEs, limited-term employees. And those are two different classifications that come with very different compensation and benefits. And it's a challenge for us as an agency. And we do have, so we currently, and we're not unique in the agency, but in our wildlife research team, we currently have, actually right as of today, we have 5 FTE scientists. On Monday, we'll have 6. So somebody new is starting. And then we have somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 people in the LTE classification. And those people range from our seasonal employees who maybe are coming to work for us in between college semesters, or working with us at the start of their careers. But then we have a number of people. I'm trying to think of how many people that have been with us for 3, 4, 5 more years, are essentially permanent employees, have been with the agency for a long time. They're very highly skilled. Many of them have PhDs. They're critical members of the team, and I wish that we had the ability to bring them into permanent status and compensate them at the rate at which their work is worth. But we are using the tools that are available to us, and one thing that's great is that we do have such dedicated people. We have incredibly talented people all across the board, and regardless of their classification or their, whether they're in FT or LT status, they're all equal members of the team and making critical contributions. And some of them are here tonight, at least a couple. So. It's a great group of folks, and I feel very fortunate to be a part of that group. So.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dave McFarland. Thanks so much. All right. So write your state senators and your state representatives and tell them to fully fund the DNR, maybe get some more FTEs. Yeah, great. Thanks also, thanks to the Minocqua Brewing Company and to our partners, the Trout Lake Station, Camp Natural Resources Station, the Lakeland Badger Chapter, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, the Minocqua Public Library, and the Brittingham Foundation. And please remember that our Science on Tap next time will be insects with PJ Leash. That's on December 4th. And we have a clipboard in the back. If you want to have your name added to our email list, please sign your name and write clearly. And we also have some cards if you have some suggestions for future topics. We would appreciate to hear what you would like to hear about. So thank you very much. We'll see you next month.